All right, welcome to this unique stream here in the sense that uh, we haven't really covered a lot of this topic in a long time. So I guess it's not totally unique. But years ago, we did get pretty deep into the history of things like Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas being an offshoot of Muslim Brotherhood. And if you are interested in that, this old talk goes a lot deeper into that. So I will put that in the description right here. So today we're going to talk about the history of this region and give context, the big picture meta context to understanding what's going on here, so that we can come to it with a better bird's eye perspective, hopefully. I don't really obviously take either side in this issue because as an Orthodox person, both Islam and either the socialist state of Israel or the rabbinic state or the rabbinic perspective within Israel is obviously contrary to the Orthodox view. So, but there is I think, a degree of managed dialectic that we can discuss with this topic. So the first point that I want to get to is the history that we find in the very key book by Quigley, Anglo-American Establishment, because he has a whole section on the history of the Balfour Declaration and its background for today's partitioning dispute that underlies the conflict now. And so it's not very long. There's about 4 pages that we need to look at here in Quigley. Hopefully that will be insightful. Then we'll get the imperial perspective of what the British Empire's plan was for this region. And then we'll get into some touchier subjects, maybe in the sense of like history of the Mossad and the history of Ben Gurion and the Irgun and this kind of stuff, how they basically overthrew British imperial rule, and then the origins and training of Mossad as well, which also obviously ties to British intelligence and the OSS and other figures that you probably wouldn't expect in terms of Tiny Mustache Man. So we'll get into that in the part 2. The part 2 will be available on my Rockfin and to my members. But so again, so the origins of the Muslim Brotherhood, we have to understand it goes back to the origins of the British imperial strategy for the Middle East. And it was the British Empire that came up with the idea that rather than trying to coax people into a new version of Islam, it'd be better to utilize the strategy of radical Islam or fundamentalist Islam, so to speak, Sunni Islam and so forth in its traditional format, as a wedge, as a way to manage the tribal disputes of a lot of the areas of the Middle East. And so out of the British imperial strategy, they would send people over like Kim Philby's dad, St. John Philby, who became converted to Islam to do his spy work. T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, was involved in, again, divvying up, partitioning the Middle East according to the British imperial dictum. And so partitioning is a key element that the British Empire had as their strategy. It's actually mentioned in Quigley here, as we're going to read on page 169 and forward, as one of the key ways that the empire would have various outposts and manage conflicts. And so this is very important. According to Dr. Carroll Quigley in his historical text, it was actually Lord Milner and not Balfour that was the real author of the Declaration. So together it was Lord Rothschild and Lord Milner that were behind Balfour. And you might be surprised if you didn't know this, but originally the idea was that both sides would have a place there. I'll read this because it's a very important piece of history that few know about in Carroll Quigley's classic text. He says, the origin and supervision of the power of the mandate system was largely a result of the Milner Circle and the Milner Group. This applied to Palestine as well as to all the other mandates. Palestine, however, had a peculiar position among the mandates because of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. It stated that Britain would regard with favor the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, and that this declaration, which is always known as the Balfour Declaration, would rather be called the Milner Declaration, since Lord Milner was the actual craftsman and was its chief supporter in the War Cabinet. This fact was not made public until July 21st, 1937, At that time, Ormsby and Gore, speaking for the government and the Commons, stated that the draft was originally put up by Lord Balfour was not the final draft approved by the War Cabinet. The particular draft, as we said, ended up being Lord Milner and the Cecil Rhodes Milner Circle. The cabinet at that time received strong support from General Smuts. Once the mandate was set up, also in terms that were drafted up by Milner, the Milner Group took little actual part in the administration of Palestine. And this is where it gets interesting. None of the various high commissioners was a member of the group, and none of the various commissions concerned themselves with the problem of the Peel Commission of 1936. Reginald Copeland was one of the 6 members of the Peel Commission, and according to the unofficial information, was the chief author of the report. In spite of this lack of direct contact with the subject, the Milner Group exercised a certain amount of influence in regard to Palestine because of its general power in the councils of Conservative Party, and because Palestine was administered through the colonial office of the Milner Group. The general attitude of the Milner Group was neither pro-Arab nor pro-Zionist, although tending, if anything, to support the latter rather than the former. The group was not in any sense anti-S because of a shred. No evidence has been shown that they were. In fact, they were actually sympathetic to Jews and wanted to give a place to their legitimate aspirations to overcome their fate. This feeling, however, was rather general and remote, and it was not it was not that they were really concerned with, in my view, they weren't really concerned with the welfare of the Jews, but rather imperial strategy, basically. The feeling of anti-S was remote and rather academic. On the other hand, as with most upper-class British, they had a strong feeling for the Arabs, and the support felt actually more personal. Many members of the Milner Group had been in Arab countries. Many of them had been spies and had done, as we said, espionage-type work. And they were attracted to Arab people, Arab philosophy, Muslim thought. This is the British tendency at times towards Islam that we covered in our stream the other night about Sufis. However, this attraction of the Arabs never inclined the Milner Group as a whole, he's saying, towards anything that was a pro-Arab romanticism. This was rather to be found in people like W.S. Blunt and spy T.E. Lawrence, as you heard me say. The reluctance of the Milner Group to push the Zionist cause in Palestine was based more so on academic considerations, and this is key. These were the 2 academic considerations. Number 1, the feeling that it would not be fair to the bustling minority of Zionists to come into Palestine and thus drive the Arabs out into an inferior economic position. And number 2, the feeling that to do this would have the effect of alienating the Arabs from the Western world, and especially British culture, which at that time was especially likely to occur if the Jews obtained control of the Mediterranean coast from Egypt to Syria. Strangely enough, there is little evidence that the Milner Group was activated by strategy or economic considerations at all. Thus, the widely disseminated charges that Britain failed to support Zionism in Palestine because of anti-S or strategic impulses or economic considerations is not supported by the evidence from the Milner Group itself. This may be true of other sections of the British public, in their opinion, but is not true of the British Labour Party, where there was obviously anti-Zionist sentiment already. The Milner Group, in Palestine as in India and also probably in Ireland, this is key, the policy of the Milner-Fabian elites was motivated by the good intention concerning alienated parties. They encouraged extremism and weakened British influence in both. In the long run, this policy was pro-Arab, just as in India it was pro-Muslim. In both cases, it served to encourage an uncompromising obstructionism, which could have been avoided if Britain had merely applied the principles upon which she stood committed. The attitude of the Milner Group towards the Arabs and the Jews can be seen from the quotations of the members of the Milner Group. At the Peace Conference of 1919, discussing the relative merits of the Jews and the Arabs, General Smuts said, "They haven't the Arabs' attractive manners. They do not warm the heart by graceful subjection. They make demands, they are bitter, and they are recalcitrant, and like the Boers, they are impatient of leadership and quarrelsome amongst themselves. They see God in the shape of an oriental potentate. Years later, John Dove, in a letter to Brand, asked himself, why was there so much pro-Arab feeling amongst many of the British elite, especially in this public school caste? And this was attributed to the Arabs' good manners, derived from desert life, their love of sports, riding, and shooting. Both of these were close to the heart of the public, that's the elite schools in the UK. A little later, in another letter written from Palestine, Dove declared the whole Arab world to be in one state, that it should be one state, and it would have Syria and Palestine for its front door. That, of course, didn't ever occur. He concluded, if the Arab belongs to the Mediterranean, as T.E. Lawrence insisted, we should do nothing to stop him getting it back. And so he goes on to say, this is the letter of Dove. He says, it would certainly check out the development if it did not warp it. I suggest that partition should not be permanent. But this does not mean that a stage of friendly tutelage is necessarily a bad thing for the Arabs. On the contrary, advanced peoples can give so much to stimulate backwards ones. Above all, it must not be the kind of help which kills individuality. Personally, I don't see the slightest harm in the Jews coming to Palestine under reasonable conditions. They are the Arabs' cousins as much as are the Phoenicians, and if Zionism brings capital and labor, which will enable industries to start, it will add to the strength of a larger unit someday, which is going to include Palestine. But they must be content to be part of such a potential unit. They need not fear absorption as everything to gain. They have everything to gain from being in this Arab federation. So according to some of the Milner elites and people at this time, the idea was it would be a mutually beneficial thing, and it would be an outpost for the Anglo-American establishment. That is, Israel could function in that way. The attitude of the Milner group toward the specific problem of Zionism was expressed by Lord Milner himself in his speech of 1923. After expressing his wholehearted agreement with the British policy of the government actions in the Balfour Declaration, he said, I am not of the policy which is advocated by the extreme Zionists. That is a different thing. I believe we have only to go on steadily with the policy of Balfour, as we have ourselves interpreted it in order to be of great material progress of the area of Palestine, and as a gradual subsistence of the present Arab agitation, the force of which would be foolish to deny, but which I believe to be largely due to artificial stimulus and to a great extent to be excited from without. The symptoms of any real and general dissatisfaction of the mass of the Arab population with the conditions under which they live, I think would be difficult to discover. This is writing in 1922. This is his 1922 speech. There's plenty of room in that country for a considerable immigrant population without injuring in any way the resident Arab population, and indeed, in many ways, it would lend to their extreme benefit. There are about 700,000 people in Palestine at this time, and there is room for millions. I am always of the position and have been a pro-Arab policy supporter, which is why the first advocate in the country is, of course, he's saying that's from me, I'm the first advocate for that. And so he went on to say that he felt that Palestine would require a permanent mandate, and that under that condition, it could become a national home also for Jews, and could take as many Jewish immigrants as the country could economically support. However, Lord Balfour did not want it to ever become a Jewish state, which is interesting. And that actually will change later on when we get to some of the discussions of the Irgun and what happened there when Israel overthrew British imperial rule. This was the point of view of the Milner group at this time, and it remained the point of view of the British government until 1939. Like Milner and his society, and this is also Lord Rothschild as well, the position they thought was essentially fair, and it was compromising and well-intentioned. It broke down Palestine because of the obstructionism of the Arabs, and the intention of the Zionists was to have political control of their national home. If they got one, the pressure of both Arabs and Jews in the world depression, the pressure on both Arabs and Jews from the world depression after 1929, and the need for a refuge from Tiny Mustache Man for European Jews after 1933. So they also thought it would be a way for Jews to have a refuge from Tiny Mustache Man. The Milner Group did not approve of the efforts of the Labor government in 1929 to 31 to end Zionist rights within Palestine. They protested against this in a famous white paper of 1930, which was regarded as the anti-Zionist white paper. Baldwin, Austin Chamberlain, Leopold Amory all protested against the document of 1930, and Smuts sent a telegram. Anyway, the idea was to have this controlled partition situation, and this is part of the British policy that we read existed for, at least the British imperial strategy was to partition both Ireland and India in the same way that Israel would be partitioned, and you have supposedly this mutually beneficial situation that would benefit both sides somehow, supposedly. However, it was also a kind of a powder keg that was waiting to erupt, and that's exactly what happened when we get to the history in this really good essay. Where is it at? Yeah, here. And this is the history of Israel at age 75, how inept British intelligence failures failed to contain Jewish independence groups. Before they were Israeli, this is just a public academic page, theconversation.com. Before they were Israeli, the Jewish community of Palestine, the Yeshuv, had been Britain's close junior partner. That's the 1939 that we just saw in the Quigley text. A dispute over Britain's restriction on Jewish immigrants into Palestine began in 1939, and that was because of these Milner policies that we just read about. And this was set aside during the struggle with Tiny Mustache Man. In the white paper of that year, the British government declared that the Jewish national home that was promised in the 1917 Balfour Declaration was a settled policy. It planned to replace the direct rule with a direct democratic government ruling for all. These plans never matured because of the war and because of the Palestinian and Zionist resistance to it. Zionist institutions supported Britain's war effort against a common existential threat or enemy, but their frustration boiled over when it was done. The monthly quota of 1,500 Jewish immigrants was seen by the Yeshuv as complicit with Tiny Mustache Man's genocide. They would no longer compromise on the issue. After decades of close security and counterterrorism cooperation, wartime cooperation in covert action, propaganda, economic warfare, signaling, and other elements of intelligence work, the Zionist leader and future Prime Minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, launched a secret war on Britain. So this is now the Jewish attempt to overthrow British imperial dominance in the region. Now, keep in mind that that's why this issue is really complex, because most of the time people are thinking of it just as two sides, but it's actually an imperial strategy that was using this region as an outpost. There's a great section, there's a chapter in F. William Ingdahl's book, Lost Hegemon, where he covers Sykes-Picot and he covers Balfour Declaration and the desire of the Atlanticist establishment to use the nation-state of Israel as an outpost, as a staging ground there as well. Now, I think also there's other more criminal elements that relate to this that we'll get into later on in regard to tax havens, in regard to organized crime gangs and things like this getting safe haven, right? So there's other elements involved in this as to the motivations as to why the British wanted to divvy up and control the region in this partitioned way. So again, from the strategy of the Milner circles, Cecil, Rothschild, Balfour, Curtis, all those characters, I don't think that it's for anybody's benefit. They might have argued, as we just saw, that, it would be mutually beneficial. But ultimately, I don't think so. And I mean, you could see the logic of it too, that if there's Tiny Mustache Man persecution, the logic dictates that it would be beneficial to have the people having another place to go that are being persecuted. However, remember, this is hypocritical because of Quigley's discussion of the dual appeasement, the dual strategy of appeasement, whereby the British elites were actually fostering, funding, and aiding Tiny Mustache Man, including even the secret meetings with their agent, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the British intelligence spy guy that we saw, the dude that literally looks like Ryan Gosling, right, hanging out with Tiny Mustache Man and all the SS and so forth. So the British Empire is basically trying to play all the sides, right? And that's typically what they did. However, playing both sides here has eventually resulted in the uprising of the Jewish militia in Palestine known as Haganah, or the Defense, which served as an auxiliary to the British police and army. Its intelligence service was called the Sherut Hayediot, or the Shay, and it supported Britain in the war effort and cooperated in the suppression of the anti-British Zionist terrorism led by two other future prime ministers, Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. When Ben-Gurion learned of a source in the cabinet that Britain would prevent European Jewish survivors from coming to Palestine, he authorized secret cooperation between the Haganah and other groups. And then so we get this is what's later called the Irgun, Shamir's Lehi, or the Stern Gang. And this leads to the event known as the King David Hotel event, BOMBING type stuff. And so you'll notice that both sides are engaged in these kinds of TERROR events, right? This is just mainline history too, by the way. This is not anything even controversial. Britain knew about these orders to cooperate thanks to their SIGINT, Signals Intelligence Service, which is today known as GCHQ, but the intelligence officers struggled to interpret the messages. Even when intelligence was accurately understood, it was difficult to act upon them without alerting the Haganah and that its codes were insecure. GCHQ relied on small cells, and including future historian Bernard Lewis, the father of neoconservatism, by the way, who was a British Jew, Samuel Stalbo, who handled the intelligence. They never leaked Britain's top secret intelligence, unlike the British government itself. Britain then made several missteps, right? After months of guerrilla tactics, we'll say, the High Commissioner of Palestine, Alan Cunningham, was finally authorized to act. So the British Army planned to arrest the leadership of the Jewish Agency, the main representatives of whom were led by Ben-Gurion. Often described by British authorities as a state within a state, or an imperium within an imperio, the Jewish Agency's relationship with armed groups was more complicated than the British had realized. In 1946, the Army and police launched what they called Operation Agatha, which arrested most of the Jewish Agency as well as some of Haganah's strike force. Its chain of command remained intact thanks to warnings from its own intelligence, allowing some of them to hide or escape. Ben-Gurion had also been in Paris, and this was the moment of the climax of his 5-year strategy to remove Zionism from British dependence, thus a pillar of the movement's approach to colonization. Operation Agatha forced the Jewish Agency and Zionist movement to consider the next step. What would they do? Independence was their only viable answer. So then it gets a little beyond what I think you can really get into here on the tubes. So if you want to, you can watch the rest of this. We're going to get into more of the history of Palestine post this stuff, a lot of which I'm not that familiar with. So this is not I know more of the history than I do of the more recent events. And where, for example, at what point does Hamas kind of break away from its original Western intelligence and support and funding and founding? So that's a question that's a bit unclear to me, perhaps to others as well. Maybe we don't know. Maybe that's, again, something to be figured out in time as more things develop on these topics, as more books are written and more books come out. But my chief sources, as you know, are Quigley's text, Mark Curtis's book, Secret Affairs. He's a Royal Institute for International Research, or Royal Institute of International Affairs researcher. And then Robert Dreyfuss's book, Devil's Game, which is a great mainline history book into investigating America's role in the Muslim Brotherhood, the West's role in radical Islamic movements, and also the Curtis book, which I cover in this talk as well. So if you're interested in that, the talk is below. We'll go deeper into some of the more dicey history with people like Tiny Mustache Men followers and what their relationship was to some of these key figures as well. And that will be over on Rockfin or to subscribers to the site. So you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis. Also want to remind you that if you're interested in really beefing up that low T that you probably got going on, because a lot of people out there got that low T going on, and that's not good. I want to remind you to head on over to our show sponsor, who is chalk.com. And chalk.com has the best in supplementation that you could even imagine. It's beyond your greatest imaginings and dreams. If you head on over to chalk.com, you can see that male vitality stack right there. You can, instead of paying $133, use the promo code J50, that's JY50, to get 50% off. And that will hold for any of the orders that you do over there. If you're looking for male vitality, you can boost your testosterone with the Tonkat Ali. You can use the mineral support that you would get from the Daily, from the 7 Wonders, all of that. It's all available over there, as well as for the ladies. If you want to get into hormone control, balancing out, mental focus and clarity through the Shilajit, it's available for you guys as well. Just use the promo code J53LIFE, that's J53LIFE, for recurring subscriptions. You get a little bit more. And the promo code J50 if you're just wanting to test it out, see if it's the right fit for you. But I think you're going to be happy, and you're going to want to get it coming every week, or excuse me, every month with the recurring subscriptions. So if you want deeper analysis, as we're going to get into, we'll move on over to Rockfin and to